So, part 6, Melbourne. I also applied locally to schools in Melbourne and I had several interviews. One interview was in Canberra, Canberra Grammar. I drove up and stayed the night at my own expense. In fact, it was not an official interview. They had not invited me for an interview. I just went up on spec. And that just shows you how desperate I was. I never told them that I had come specifically to Canberra to look for a job. I thought that I looked desperate. I was. Anyway, I visited the school and I didn't get a job offer. I also applied for Geelong Grammar, which is another high status private school, as an English teacher. This was another farcical interview. The interview seemed to go okay, considering that the interviewers didn't seem to know what they were doing. But for some reason, I wasn't confident of the outcome. I didn't have much experience as an English teacher, but they seemed to be amateurish too, the interviewers. Anyway, I was really annoyed and riled, in fact, when they didn't even bother to notify me if my application had been successful or not. I don't know what happens today, but in those days that was a very unprofessional error. You always let someone know who'd taken the time and courtesy to interview that whether their interview had been successful or not. It was common courtesy, let alone professional. Anyway, I phoned the school to register my disgust and was fobbed off several times, of course. The head wasn't there, he was overseas. Eventually, when he came back from his trip overseas, whereas he was in fact being interviewed himself for a job overseas. Anyway, he phoned me and apologized on behalf of his underlings for not notifying me earlier. Sour grapes? I don't know. Or a small victory for professionalism? I'm not sure. I also had a disastrous interview at Swinburne University, where two amateurish ESL females, about half my age, giggled and bantered their way through the interview. Again, it was an English language teaching job. I always find interviews for English positions quite demeaning. The quality of the professionals in the teaching of English as a foreign language in Australia is pretty low. Many part-time teachers are there, often housewives trying to get back into the labour market without real qualifications and looking for a job. My interviews at Swinburne asked me questions like, how would you teach vocabulary? Well, I felt like saying, perhaps I could show you how I tie my shoelaces instead. Such questions are very difficult to answer without having a context provided and knowledge of the students one is teaching. I was enraged by this type of interview. I had many more like it in Queensland. I even had one where I subsequently discovered that I hadn't been given the job because the director of studies, whose father owned the language college, didn't like my clip-on glasses. I must admit, though, that I did look a bit like Mickey Mouse in my clip-on glasses. The disappointments just kept coming one after the other in Victoria. I went to Hobart for a science job. The head seemed to be not in the slightest bit interested in me. I think this was more than just his Australian lack of curiosity. I have observed that many Australians seem to lack the most basic curiosity about people and their personal histories, especially their professional and personal history. In this case, I suspect my interviewer had already talked to the chairman on the phone. The biggest disappointment of all was that Presbyterian Ladies College, a prestigious school. I knew the head there, I knew him. He was a dour but very honourable Scot. I'd met him a few times in my professional capacity at in my previous job, and as we got on well, he invited me to apply for the position of curriculum coordinator at his school. I went to the first interview and did okay. I then got a second interview with himself, which was a complete disaster because by this time my confidence had almost evaporated entirely and I was losing more confidence each day with each letter of rejection and failed interview. For the first time ever at an interview, I had an attack of nerves, a complete blank out with the Scot. I remember him, even though I knew him, asking what role did I think English played in the curriculum. Such a simple question, and he was almost apologetic about asking it, not aggressive at all. I could have given, under normal circumstances, a quite comprehensive answer to this question. But in the circumstances, I just sat there like a stunned mullet and mumbled incoherently. After the interview, I returned home in despair. I think it was at this point that I started to change my attitude towards the whole Australian project. Up until then, I was still quite positive about the long-term prospects. But at this point, the prolonged experience of negative emotions and a maelstrom of negative energy found its expression building inside me as antipathy to Australia. Perhaps this was my only way my ego could cope with the pressure, the stress, by projecting this negativity onto some inanimate construct, such as Australia. But perhaps this was better than projecting my antipathy onto persons or even onto myself. The mind plays tricks when stressed. I sought counseling. I have to confess that in spite of my best efforts, this antipathy to Australia has never entirely disappeared. I still harbour resentments. This is a great disappointment to me because I like to pride myself on having survived and had a positive experience of the 9 countries in which I have lived. In my antipathy and resentment to Australia, I saw my own failure. Immediately after this interview, I had arranged to fly to Chiang Mai in Thailand to visit my friends. I had to get away from everything. I had to get away from Melbourne, Australia even. Maria and the children had gone to Mexico, and I couldn't face being alone any longer in Melbourne. Living literally within sight of the school and not receiving so much as a phone call from anyone was driving me to depression. When I was in Chiang Mai, I received a fax from the Scotsman telling me I had not got the job. I was devastated, but couldn't show it too much with my friends around. While I was in Chiang Mai, my friend suggested I apply by fax for a job as head of the international school in Chile. When I got back to Melbourne, I received a fax inviting me to interview in London for this Chile job. The facts said I was one of 3 candidates. My friend in Chiang Mai was able to tell me that Gavitas, Truman, and Thring, who were the recruiters, felt I had a chance. I booked my ticket to London. Money was scarce for me. I couldn't just waste my time going on a trip to London unless I had a good chance of getting the job. So anyway, I booked my ticket to London. But as the departure date came closer, I became more and more nervous about wasting money on such a trip. I was on my own. I got cold feet. I lost my nerve, and on the morning of my flight, I drove to the airport and cancelled my ticket. No internet in those days, and no refunds. It was now about October or November, and I was becoming desperate. The smooth operator had arrived in Melbourne and had made no effort to contact me, just like all the rest. I guessed he would last about 6 months. As it turned out, I was not far wrong. The school had officially paid me out with the condition that I, quote, leave the country. I had no intention of doing that because of my family, but I could not create too much fuss, so I didn't. Around Christmas, I applied for a job in El Salvador as IB coordinator. I indicated on my application that I would be prepared to go to London for interview and pay for my flight. I was becoming desperate. I was indeed invited to interview, and when I got there, I was interviewed by Mr. Nondescript. I can't remember what he looked like, but the interview went well. For some reason, though, I didn't really feel confident I was going to be offered the job by Mr. Nondescript. I never actually let him know that I had travelled all the way from Australia for an interview. Again, I didn't want him to know I was desperate. I stayed with friends in Essex. At the end of the interview, Mr. Nondescript had told me he would let me know the outcome of the interview before I went back to Australia. As I waited, I met old friends from Colombia. By coincidence, it turned out that my friend had actually been one of the other 2 candidates for the job in Chile. Wow. But he didn't get it either. I heard nothing from Mr. Nondescript before the end of the conference, and I was so angry I sped into London to try and find him. But he'd already checked out of his hotel and no doubt was nearby at the ECIS recruitment fair, where I'm sure he thought he was going to find other candidates for the position. At the fair, I went to see the secretary of the ECIS and asked him if he would mind me looking for Mr. Nondescript, because I wasn't actually registered for this recruitment fair. The secretary had no objection, no problem with this. Eventually, I found a rather sheepish looking Mr. Nondescript not far away. I nailed him and asked him why he had not contacted me and enjoyed watching him squirm. One of the many millions of people who will say they will, quote, get back to you and don't bother. By another amazing coincidence at this conference, I ran into the Yorkshireman again, of all people, the former principal of the school in Melbourne. He was recruiting for his school in Portugal. He told me, he was a very generous and kind man, and he told me that he knew of a director at the conference who was looking for a head of secondary in an international school in Zambia. Was I interested? Well, yes, I was. The director's name was Funky, so I spent the next 2 days interviewing with Funky on and off, and within 48 hours I had been offered the job. I was ecstatic, of course. This was Africa. He wanted me to start immediately, but I managed to arrange with Funky that I start in Zambia in July. This gave me 6 months to pack up in Sutherland Street in Melbourne. Why 6 months? I don't know why, really, I insisted on this 6-month wait, but I suspect it was a lack of confidence in myself to start immediately. I was too close to the recent traumas and experiences to want to throw myself immediately into the fray straight away. I needed time to rest and psych myself up. Meanwhile, we would stay on the dole.